everyone. I hope you're all doing well and working your way through the material all right. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss the second reading from Classic Questions in Contemporary Film, Chapter 7, the chapter on normative ethical theory. Last time we looked at utilitarianism, right? And this time we're going to look at Kantian ethics. The bulk of this section is taken up with what your textbook calls respect for persons ethics, which is rooted out of Kant as well, as is deontology. So Kant's known as the kind of father of deontology. And I'll talk about a little bit of a difference between those two theories once we get into the material. But remember, what we're dealing with in this chapter are normative ethical theories or prescriptive theories that aim at identifying and defending some standard of right conduct or good living. In utilitarianism, we saw that the standard is the greatest happiness principle or the utility principle. It tells us to think about the consequences of our actions and to determine which of the possible actions that we might take would have the consequences of maximizing overall happiness. It's a teleological theory. It's a consequentialist theory. It emphasizes overall happiness for the most number of people. Kantian ethics is non-teleological. It's a non-consequentialist theory. So here, right conduct is not right because of what it produces, overall good or something like that. It's based on a different criterion, this idea of the categorical imperative. And we'll talk about two different versions of the categorical imperative here, one of which kind of goes along with how your textbook presents deontology, and the other one which goes along with how it talks about respect for persons ethics. Kant himself wrote in a way that seems to indicate that all of his different formulations of the categorical imperative were meant to like kind of mutually reinforce one another or at least be consistent with one another. But your textbook kind of takes a different tack on that. So it's just something to keep in mind. So let's get into this. So deontology, right? So this is a non-consequentialist approach to moral theory. It says that what's important about an action are not the consequences of the action, but the intention or maxim that we're acting upon. Right? And so this theory, Kantian ethics, central to Kantian ethics of any stripe, is the idea of an obligation. Now, utilitarianism had obligations as well. We're obligated under that theory to maximize overall happiness and to perform those actions or follow those social policies that if everyone followed would maximize overall happiness. So that's, again, teleological and consequentialist. Deontology and respect for persons, neither of those are consequentialist or teleological theories. They base, so that's why I say here in the definitions, especially of deontology, that there are obligations, that this theory emphasizes the idea that there are obligations binding on all rational agents, regardless of the ends or purposes or goals that we are pursuing. And likewise, respect for persons ethics is a non-consequentialist theory, although it's non-absolutist. Your textbook talks about, and many people have interpreted Kant as offering a very rigorous moral theory that involves moral absolutes. So these are moral principles or judgments that should never be broken or never be overridden by any other moral norm or demand. And so this is the way your textbook splits these up, is that the one version of Kantianism that has absolutes is deontology. The non-absolutist version is the respect for persons tack. And so the respect for persons idea is the idea that we have obligations to refrain from using other autonomous or rational agents as mere means. And that's rooted in the second version of the categorical imperative. All right, so let's take a look at two different versions of the categorical imperative and the kind of moral tests that they give us, right? For determining right conduct. Right? So first here I have a little thought experiment. It's called Jameson and Reagan's chainsaw. Most of us are taught when we're young kids that what we all ought to do with regard to promises is always keep our promises, right? And so here's so it's kind of an absolute, at least stated that way. Keep your promises. That looks like an absolutist statement. Doesn't have any exceptions built into the rule or anything like that. And so here's a thought experiment that raises the question of promise breaking. So imagine you borrowed a chainsaw from a friend, promising to return it whenever he asks for it. Imagine he turns up at your door in a visibly drunken state, accompanied by a bound and gagged companion who has already been severely beaten and is in a state of terror. I'll have my chainsaw now, he intones. Ought you to return it under those circumstances? And so we can ask ourselves, well, what does the categorical imperative say we ought to do in this situation? You might also ask yourself, just according to you, what you think ought to be done there, and what moral principle, if any, supports that decision about what to do, whether to break the promise and not return the chainsaw there. So again, keeping that idea in mind, let's turn to Kant here. And again, we're going to look at two different versions of the categorical imperative. The first one kind of goes along with deontology, and the second one goes along with respect for persons' ethics. And here I'm just kind of taking my point of departure from how your textbook discusses things. I kind of have some quibbles with it, but we don't have to get into all of that just to get the basic ideas down. So let's just take a look at these theories. And once again, I've pulled out a few kind of influential key passages from Kant's work, The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, where he talked about these ideas. So again, some key ideas to keep in mind here. How do we understand obligation according to deontologists? Deontology means the study of duties or obligations, right? Keep in mind it's a non-teleological theory. I'm going to talk about two different types of imperatives, but only the categorical imperative is the basis of morality, and then this idea of autonomy. Right? It's going to be important, especially for the second half of the lecture here. So here's the basic idea of the categorical imperative. It's an obligation binding on all rational beings, regardless of our aims, goals, or projects, even our collective goals. So it's non-teleological. Again. So here's the first formulation, often called the universal law formula of the categorical imperative. So Kant says, since the universality of a law according to which effects are produced constitutes what is properly called nature in the most general sense, that is the existence of things so far as they can be determined by general laws, the imperative of duty may be thus expressed thus: act as if the maxim of thy action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. So again, this is a criteria that helps us answer the question, what ought I do? It's important to keep in mind that that I in the question, what ought I do, is not Chris Blakely with my particular wants, my particular desires or personal preferences or anything like that. Kant says that we have to clear moral reasoning of everything that's merely empirical, and that means everything that's merely, contingent or particular to me or just subjective, right? Remember, he's trying to identify an objective standard for morality. So that means it can't be based on personal considerations or cultural considerations, which are particular and contingent and change over time, right? So he says, act as if the maxim of thy action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. So there's a couple of things in this that need to be noted. First is, what's a maxim? Well, a maxim is a subjective principle of action. So right now, I'm feeling a little thirsty, and you're about to see me take a drink of water. So according to Kant, every action enshrines some maxim, some principle for which we are acting. So when I am thirsty, I will take a drink of water. That's the maxim that was just underlying my action there. So a maxim, again, is just a subjective principle of volition or of action. We could talk about it just more plainly in the sense of what's your intention here? What are you acting for, and why are you doing? So then he says here, act as if thy maxim of thy action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. So what Kant means by the will is the rational will. He distinguishes between our rational will and our rational agency and our inclinations, our bodily desires. And of course, for Kant, as it is the case with many philosophers, what's the real self is the rational universal self, right? So that's what he's driving at there by will. It's not act as you want everyone else to act. It's act on principles that can be willed as a universal law. And so that's the second part, a universal law of nature. Well, something can't be a universal and objective law of nature if it contains contradictions. So what Kant is really saying here is that I'm only supposed to act on maxims that can be rationally willed as a universal law of nature without contradiction. So that means when I universalize my maxim, if it generates any kind of contradiction or irrationality, then that's that tells me it's morally wrong to act on that action. It's a prohibition, or it's impermissible to act on that maxims. I should only act on maxims that can pass this test, right? And so Kant gives us several examples of this. He gives 4 examples, and they're examples of duties, 2 different examples of duties to oneself, 2 different duties to others, and then this distinction between what he calls perfect duty and an imperfect duty. Perfect duties are like absolutes. So here's Kant's first example on empty promises. So he says, and so we're going to see him apply this first formulation of the categorical imperative here. So he says, another man finds himself forced by need to borrow money. He well knows that he will not be able to repay it, but he also sees that nothing will be loaned to him if he does not firmly promise to repay it at a certain time. He desires to make such a promise, but he has enough conscience to ask himself whether it is not improper and opposed to duty to relieve his distress in such a way. Now, assuming that he does decide to do so, the maxim of his action would be as follows. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to repay it, although I know I shall never do so. So that's the maxim in this example. Now, this principle of self-love or of your own benefit may very well be compatible with your whole future welfare. So that looks like a utilitarian consideration there, right? But Kant's saying that's not what's important in morality. He says, but the question is whether it's right. He changes the pretension of self-love into a universal law, and then puts the question, how would it be if my maxim became a universal law? He immediately sees that it could never hold as a universal law of nature and be consistent with itself. Rather, it must necessarily contradict itself. For the universality of a law which says that anyone who believes himself to be in need could promise what he pleased with the intention of not fulfilling it would make the promise itself and the end to be accomplished by it impossible. No one would believe what is promised to him, but would only laugh at such assertion at its vain pretense. So note 2 things there. We have the maxim, identification of the maxim of the action, and we have the universal formula, or the universal restatement of that maxim as a universal, and then we have the identification of a contradiction. And he mentions 2 different things there. The promise itself, right? The idea of a promise that you don't intend to keep is a contradiction in terms. It's not promises are just things that you intend to keep, right? That's the basic idea of a promise. And also, promise making for securing loans, right? So there's it would undermine the purpose of ever getting loans. If everybody made false promises all the time, no one would believe promises anymore, and promise making would cease to be a means that could actually work to guarantee a loan, right? Or to make a promise there. So it looks like on Kant's view, we always got to keep our promises. So go back to our thought experiment. On the face of it, anyway, it looks like Kant's saying that it's on you to return the chainsaw in that scenario. So we can get here a simplified universalizability test. This isn't the whole thing. It's a little bit more complicated than this. But for our purposes in Intro to Philosophy, this will suffice as an entry point here. So first, identify the maxim of the action. And I have 2 examples of ways that you might put that. In order to blank, I will blank. So in my example earlier, in order to quench my thirst, I will take a drink of water, or I will take a drink of water in order to quench my thirst, right? Now recast that maxim as a universal law of nature governing the conduct of all rational agents. Everyone, in order to quench their thirst, everyone will take a drink of water, or everyone takes a drink of water in order to quench their thirst. Notice it's not like a promise that I don't intend to keep there. So it looks like we got a maxim there that passes the universalizability test there. So we don't have any contradictions. If we did generate a contradiction when we universalize the maxim, then again, we have a duty not to act on that. A perfect duty, as Kant would say. And so that looks like it gives us an absolutist version of a Kantian moral theory there based on the first formula of the categorical imperative. Well, let me back up here a second. So you could, as a fun thing you might do here is take a look at the episode Morty Night Run of Rick and Morty and use the universalizability test on Rick's selling of weapons to an unethical assassin. He sells the maxim in that scenario is pretty well laid out clearly. He says that He's selling weapons to an unethical assassin in order to get money for entertainment. So that would be the maxim of his action. Now everyone sells money, sells weapons to an unethical assassin. Does that generate a contradiction? If everyone's selling weapons to an unethical assassin, that means all of us are going to be subject to being killed. It looks like we might have a problem. So that's the simplified universalizability test. Again, Kant gives us the example of promise breaking and truth-telling as examples of perfect duties. He also says that we have imperfect duties to contribute to other people's happiness. And we have a perfect duty not to kill ourselves out of self-love. So a certain kind of suicide then is outlawed, is morally impermissible according to Kant. That's the first way of thinking about Kant. Now, the main way that your textbook talks about Kant is the second way, the respect for persons ethics. So let's take a look at that. You might pause here for a second, just to think about what we've covered so far and whether or not you've got any questions, and if so, write those down and either email me later after you see this, or post them in the discussion forum. All right, so here's the second version of the categorical imperative. And again, there are at least 3 of these in Kant's writing, depending on whether you count this other thing called the autonomy formula as one or not is an issue, but we'll just take a look at this second version. Let's call this the humanity or the end in itself formula of the categorical imperative. So he says, so act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. What he means is an end in itself that is intrinsically valuable. So in Kant's view, it's not pleasure that's intrinsically valuable and pain that's intrinsically bad, like it was in utilitarianism. Notice he hadn't talked about happiness or pleasure or pain at all. He's just talking about whether we can universalize a maxim, and here he's talking about whether we're using someone as a mere means or not. So by humanity in this formula, Kant doesn't really mean just members of the Homo sapiens species. He's not talking about humanity in a biological sense. He's talking about it in a metaphysical sense. And what he means by that is rational personhood. Human beings, in fact, Kant thought what distinguished human beings from all the other living things is our capacity for reason, right? So again, we have obligations that are binding on all rational agents, and we have obligations to rational agents. Here, it's pretty clear what my obligation is. I'm required to refrain from using another rational agent as a mere means. So he says, again, treat humanity, what he means by that is rational agents, whether in your own person or that in any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Well, the key thing here is merely as a means, right? So to use someone as a mere means would involve that in principle they didn't have an opportunity to consent or really give informed consent to the plan that I'm involving them in. So the basic idea here is don't use rational agents, don't use people, right? But there's a way in which you and I are both using each other right now. You're using me to get information and at college towards a college degree, and I'm using you to get a paycheck, right? At least in some ways there. But notice that that's something we agreed to do, right? First of all, so it's not like we were forced into it. We had an opportunity to decide whether or not to go to college, and I had an opportunity to decide whether or not I wanted to take the job, right? So that's a key element in this. So it's not that you can't do things with other people, right? Or get a benefit from acting with another person. It means that you can't use them as a mere means, right? So we'll come back to a pretty clear example of using someone as a mere means here in just a second. So here's a little bit more to fill out that second formula, the categorical imperative. He says non-rational, so think animals or things, right, have only a relative value as means, and they're therefore called things. So that's just instrumental value, right? Rational beings, on the contrary, are called persons because their very nature points them out as ends in themselves, that is, as something which must not be used merely as a means, and so far, therefore, restricts freedom of action and is the object of respect. These, therefore, are not merely subjective ends whose existence has a whole worth for us as an effect of our action, but as objective ends, that is, things whose existence is an end in itself, an end, moreover, for which no other can be substituted. So I mentioned two kinds of imperatives earlier. One of them is a hypothetical imperative, but it's conditional. It's if I want to achieve some end, then I will perform some means. I'll take certain means to achieve that end. So if I want to clean my white sheets, but I want to keep my white sheets white, I will necessarily refrain from washing them with things in color in them. But if I want to make pink sheets or red sheets, I'm going to throw a red sweater in there with them, right? So again, that's based on just me wanting to achieve a particular end. That's hypothetical imperatives. Kant doesn't deny that there are hypothetical imperatives. It's just that oftentimes they conflict with duty in a moral sense. So that's what we really have to watch out for in Kant's view, is that morality, duty, often requires us to do things other than what we might happen to have an inclination to do or desire to do. Notice nowhere is he talked about morality being based on our desires. It's about being based on our rational will here in our respect for intrinsically valued rational agents. So another key thing in this passage is he mentions restrictions on freedom, right? And we're always worried about a liberty limiting principle. In utilitarianism, we saw that that was the harm principle. In respect for persons ethics and Kantian ethics, the categorical imperative performs both roles. It tells us what we can do, but also what we ought not do, and therefore tells us what are justifiable restrictions on our individual freedom. Because the idea is that if I have certain freedoms, other rational agents have those same freedoms as well. They're supposed to be reciprocal, right? And if they don't have certain freedom, if it's not justified, then it has to be rooted in the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative here is saying that I'm free, but I'm not morally free, right, to use others as mere means. It restricts what I can do to another agent without their informed consent. And there is an issue. By consent, Kant doesn't mean just they utter the phrase "I agree" or something synonymous with that. It has to be, it has to maintain their rational autonomy, right? So in other words, it doesn't look like I can give informed rational consent to sell myself into slavery, for example, because then that would be treating myself like a mere thing. Right? I can say I agree to do it, but Kant's point is that I'm undermining my rational dignity, and therefore that's what's supposed to restrict my actions there. So your textbook puts the normative standard for respect for persons slightly differently, but here it is. And they use the example of Horton hears a who, so the who's are little rational agents, right? They're not recognized as such by everybody, but then Horton is worried about them. Right? So your textbook author says, everyone ought to respect persons, including oneself, as autonomous agents and thereby treat them as ends into themselves and not merely as a means to an end. Right? So that's the basic idea there. So here we could get an ends test. Does the maxim that I'm acting on, does it use anyone as a mere means? And if it does, then it's morally impermissible to act on that maxim. So you get the formula here. And again, I want to encourage you to be sure and take a hard look at how the textbook uses Horton here's a who to illustrate that. That'll give you a basic plan for how you need to think in order to do your short answer assignments for this chapter. So the way that the textbook uses Saving Private Ryan or Horton here's a who or Groundhog Day, those are models for how you should do the short answer assignment for this section. All right, so there's a little bit of a Horton here's a who. I mentioned respect for persons. Kant's ethics doesn't say much about animals. What it does say is it indicates that I don't have direct obligations to animals because they're not rational agents. So there's a little bit of an issue there. And then to go along with this lecture, definitely what you need to do is to watch the episode Rick Potion number 9 from Rick and Morty. The question is, according to respect for persons ethics, is it morally permissible for Morty to give Jessica the love potion? And explain why or why not. And then according to a second question you might worry about is, according to respect for persons ethics, is it morally permissible for Rick to help Morty win Jessica's affection by giving him the love potion? Explain why or why not. The main question I want you to worry about is the more direct one about Morty's actions in that scenario. So that's a good piece of pop culture to worry about there with regard to Rick and Morty and Kantian ethics. So the distinction that your textbook makes here is that deontology looks moral absolutist and respect for persons looks non-absolutist. My one little quibble there is that it looks like I'm, supposed to at least be absolutist in the sense that I'm not treating others as mere means or myself, right? So a little bit of a quibble there. And on the other side, I also think that Kant says some things where his idea of a perfect duty has some wiggle room in it as well. He says that if we were in a world where everyone had good intentions, everyone would have an absolute obligation to keep their promises and always tell the truth. But we don't live in a world where everyone has good intentions, and some people want to use my honesty or promise keeping as mere means. So it looks like maybe there's some wiggle room around a absolutist interpretation of Kant in regard to deontology there. All right, so that's a little bit on deontology and respect for persons, both rooted in the categorical imperative. Again, that's the idea of an obligation binding on everyone, right? All rational agents, right? So again, contrast that standard for moral consideration with that in utilitarianism. It's not about being a sentient being in Kantian ethics, it's about being a rational being. So if I was rational, but couldn't experience pleasure or pain for some bizarre physiological reason, people would still have obligations to me and I'd still have obligations to them. All right, so then let's just wrap up a little bit there with some criticisms of deontology. So again, some people have taken the absolutist interpretation of Kant to be a good reason to reject that. They want to say that, look, even though that there are very rigorous moral norms, that they can be overridden by other moral norms in different circumstances. We have the problem of conflicting duties, moral dilemmas. That looks like a contradiction, right? It's true that I ought do X, and that it's true I ought not do X. That looks like a logical contradiction. That could pose a problem for deontology. So remember, contradictions aren't supposed to be true, and here we would be worrying about moral contradictions, right? I mentioned the worry about excluding animals and other sentient beings because they don't qualify as persons under Kant's view. We also have this idea of the moral do-gooder objection. So many of us probably think that I should not only do the right thing, but I should want to do the right thing. Well, under deontology, it looks like if I'm doing the right thing, but I'm doing it, I'm doing what I'm obligated to do, but I'm begrudgingly doing it. I don't really want to do it. I still get full moral credit for accomplishing the duty, for fulfilling the duty, but that looks like it's a weird thing, right? People ought to be praised for doing good because they want to do the good thing and actually do it. And then there's the paradox of deontology that poses a little bit of a problem, right? So here's how the utilitarianism looks really good at taking account of problems that involve numbers of people. Kantian ethics, not so much. What if violating the rights of one autonomous agent would protect the rights of many others? So how is it that the deontologist or the respect for persons theorist might address that problem? It looks like, and this is the answer that some have given, including Nozick, who I mentioned here at the end in one of the slides, is he says that, look, there's just side constraints that that prohibit us from using like one person as a mere means in order to get everybody else that survives them being used as a mere means as to get everybody else a benefit. So on a Kantian view, if you had a society, a bunch of Kantians, you're not really worried about trying to make everybody happy. You have to contribute to other people's happiness sometimes, but you get discretion about how to do that. Whereas utilitarianism, it looks like I've got to, give up a lot of my expendable income and stuff like that to alleviate harm in the world. Whereas on Kantian system, I can be fairly restrictive. We might end up with more people dead or more poverty than you would in a utilitarian society in that regard. And so here, just to, one little last thing by way of conclusion, consider John Stuart Mill. Remember, he's our utilitarian. Remember, he offers a criticism of Kant's theory. So just real quickly here to wrap things up as a final point, let's take a look at this. He says, when Kant propounds the fundamental principle of morals, so act that the rule of conduct might be adopted by all rational beings, he virtually acknowledges that the interest of mankind collectively, or at least of mankind discriminately, must be in the mind of the agent when conscientiously deciding on the morality of the act. Otherwise, he uses words without meaning. For the rule even of utter selfishness could not possibly be adopted by all rational beings, and there is any usurpable obstacle in the nature of things to its adoption cannot be plausibly maintained. To give any meaning to Kant's principle, the sense that must be put upon it that we ought to shape our conduct by a rule which all rational beings might adopt for the benefit of our collective interest. So what Mill's saying here is that although Kant claims that he's not really offering a teleological theory or a consequentialist theory, in order to put any meat on the actual obligations that we have to at least be implicitly assuming some kind of collective interest on the part of people. So maybe there's a problem with maybe Kant's theory really is teleological when it purports to not be. Right, okay, and so that's a little bit about Kantian ethics, two different flavors of Kantian ethics there, deontology and respect for persons. Again, be sure you read the chapter thoroughly and go back and watch that episode of Rick and Morty, Rick Potion number 9, and do the study sheet on that in preparation for short answer assignment due at the end of this chapter. It'll be your last one for the semester. We're getting close to the end here. And again, if you have any questions, please shoot me an email or post them in the forums. I hope y'all are all safe and doing well and making the best out of the situation that you can. We'll talk to y'all soon. Bye-bye.